It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Emily and her younger brother, Jason, ventured deeper into the woods than they ever had before. The sun was beginning its slow descent behind the tall trees, casting long shadows that stretched like dark fingers across the forest floor. Birds had stopped chirping, and an unsettling silence hung in the air, making the otherwise peaceful woods feel oddly foreboding. They had heard the stories. Local legends whispered about strange occurrences deep in the woods, the kind of stories children dared not repeat when the firelight flickered. Emily, the more adventurous of the two, was drawn to these whispers, especially when Jason, with his wide eyes and curiosity, had been asking more questions than usual. He was fascinated by the mysterious tales but terrified of the unknown. And it was that mixture of fear and fascination that led them here. "Are you sure we should be going this far?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He tugged at Emily's sleeve, a nervous habit he had picked up ever since they had been kids. His eyes darted nervously around the trees, as if expecting something to jump out at any moment. "Don't be such a baby," Emily teased, though she couldn't entirely shake the strange feeling creeping up her spine. "We've been out here 100 times before. Nothing's going to happen." But even as she said the words, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder. The woods seemed to be closing in on them, the trees pressing closer as the daylight began to fade. The further they walked, the more the path seemed to vanish beneath their feet, overtaken by thick underbrush and tangled vines. The air grew colder, and an almost imperceptible mist began to form around them, curling like fingers around their ankles. Then they saw it, a mirror. It stood tall and unnervingly out of place among the trees. The frame was old, weathered with intricate carvings that looked almost too deliberate for something so ancient. The glass, however, was what caught their attention. Unlike any mirror they had ever seen, it reflected not the dense, shadowed forest around them, but an eerie, twisted version of it. The trees were distorted, their branches twisting like skeletal arms. The sky in the reflection was a deep, sickly green, the clouds swirling in unnatural patterns. The mist seemed thicker in the mirror, almost alive, as if it was moving. "Emily, do you see that?" Jason whispered, his voice trembling. Emily stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out to touch the glass, but something stopped her. A chill ran through her fingers just before she made contact, making her hesitate. The reflection of the forest seemed to shimmer, the twisted trees in the mirror bending in a way that wasn't possible in the real world. For a brief moment, Emily thought she saw something, or rather someone, moving in the reflection. A figure, cloaked in darkness, standing just beyond the trees, watching them. Her breath caught in her throat. "Is someone there?" Jason asked, his voice now quivering. The figure in the mirror didn't move, but Emily could feel it, like a presence pressing down on her, drawing her in. She quickly stepped back, pulling Jason with her. "Let's go." "Now," Emily said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to sound confident. The strange feeling in her stomach gnawed at her, an instinctual sense that something was terribly wrong. But Jason wasn't moving. His gaze was locked on the mirror, his feet frozen to the ground. I don't think we should leave," he whispered. Emily looked at him in disbelief. "What? Are you crazy? We need to get out of here right now." But Jason was transfixed, his eyes wide and distant. Slowly, he began to move closer to the mirror, his hand reaching out, almost against his will. Emily grabbed his arm, pulling him back with all her strength. "Jason, stop!" Suddenly, the mirror flickered, the reflection warping and shifting in front of their eyes. For a split second, Emily saw a glimpse of something else, something worse. The figure in the reflection was now closer, standing right behind them, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Jason gasped, pulling away from Emily's grip. "Jason, no!" Emily cried, but it was too late. In that instant, the world around them seemed to go silent, the forest frozen in place. A dark figure stepped out of the mirror, its form solidifying, growing taller and taller until it towered over them. Its face was obscured, but Emily could feel its cold, menacing gaze on her. And then, in the blink of an eye, it lunged. The forest screamed in silence as the mirror shattered. Emily's heart was racing as she stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The air around her felt heavy, thick with an unnatural chill that clung to her skin. Jason was gone. The moment the mirror shattered, he had vanished, without a sound, without a trace. The forest around her felt wrong, as if it was closing in, the trees pressing closer, the once familiar path now lost to her. She spun around in a panic, her eyes darting from tree to tree, but there was no sign of her brother. The eerie reflection was gone, replaced by the dark, desolate forest they had wandered into. The wind howled through the trees, making the branches sway and creak, but it was as if Emily couldn't hear it. Not really. All she could hear was the pounding of her heart, echoing in her ears like a drum. "Jason!" she called out, her voice trembling. "Jason, where are you?" No answer. The silence was deafening, a silence that gnawed at her sanity, making her feel as though she were no longer alone, but trapped in a space where time and reality no longer followed their usual rules. The trees seemed to sway in rhythm, bending and twisting, almost as if they were alive, watching her every move. She felt an inexplicable urge to run, to get away from the place that had swallowed her brother, but her feet felt glued to the ground. Her mind was racing, frantic thoughts, images of Jason's terrified face flickering through her mind. The mirror, that thing in the reflection. It wasn't just a trick of the light. She knew that now. It had been real. Whatever it was, it had taken Jason. With trembling hands, Emily reached down and picked up a shard of the shattered mirror from the ground. The edges were sharp, jagged, but she didn't care. She needed to find Jason. She couldn't lose him, not after everything they had been through together. She looked at the shard in her hand. The world around her seemed to pulse and shift as her reflection twisted, just like the trees in the mirror had done moments before. Emily dropped the shard in shock, her breath catching in her throat. The reflection in the broken piece of glass was wrong, distorted. It was like looking through a funhouse mirror, but worse. There was a faint, dark shape behind her. No, couldn't be. She spun around quickly, her eyes wide with terror. Nothing. Her chest tightened, panic threatening to choke her. She stumbled backward, almost tripping over a root, but managed to catch herself. She had to keep moving. There was no time to stand around and wait for answers that weren't coming. As she continued deeper into the forest, the trees grew thicker, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes. The path had all but disappeared, swallowed by the undergrowth, and soon, she found herself completely surrounded by darkness. The sun had long since set, leaving only the faint light of the moon to guide her way. The wind had died down, but the air felt thick, oppressive, as if something unseen was watching her every step. Then she heard it. A soft whisper came from the trees. No, not from the trees, from within them. A voice, faint and distant, like a breath carried on the wind, but there was no one around. The voice spoke her name. "Emily." She froze. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked around wildly, but there was no one. She was alone, wasn't she? "Emily." The voice came again, clearer this time, and she could swear she heard it coming from behind her. But when she turned, there was only the dense forest, dark and silent. watching her with its eerie stillness. Panic set in. She had to get out of there. Her legs moved before her mind could process the decision, and she ran. She didn't care which direction she was going. She just needed to get away from the voice, from whatever was watching her. Her feet pounded the earth beneath her, and her breath came in ragged gasps as she weaved through the trees, blindly hoping she would find her way out. But the forest was changing. It wasn't the same as it had been when she first entered. The trees were taller now, their branches knotted together, blocking out the moonlight. The ground was uneven, and the air felt colder, as though the temperature had dropped suddenly, without warning. Emily shivered, her breath visible in the chill air. Then she saw it, a faint light in the distance, flickering like a candle, shining through the trees. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether to approach, but something told her she had no choice. The light might be her only hope of finding her way out. She stumbled toward it, her steps becoming more hurried, more desperate. As she got closer, the light grew brighter, revealing an old, dilapidated cabin nestled between the trees. It looked abandoned, its windows dark and empty, but there was something about it, something that made her heart race even faster. She approached cautiously, her hand shaking as she reached for the door. Just as her fingers touched the cold wood, the door creaked open on its own, revealing the darkness inside. The whisper came again, "Come in." Against her better judgment, Emily stepped inside. The air inside the cabin was stale, heavy with dust and the scent of decay. The floorboards creaked under her feet as she made her way into the dark, musty interior. The only source of light was the flickering candle on the table, casting eerie shadows across the room. And then Emily saw it, the mirror. It stood tall in the far corner of the room, just like the one in the woods. But this one was different. It was larger, its frame ornate and gilded, though the gold was tarnished with age. The glass was dark, almost black, and the reflection within it was not the cabin she was standing in. It was the forest, the same twisted trees, the sickly green sky, the swirling mist. But this time there was something new. In the reflection there was a figure she recognized. Jason. He was standing in the reflection, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He was trapped in the mirror, just as she had been. His mouth moved, but no sound came from it. He was trying to tell her something, but what? What was happening? Emily reached toward the mirror, her hand trembling, but before she could touch it, the reflection shifted again. Jason's face twisted in terror as something dark and menacing moved toward him, reaching out from the shadows. A low growl echoed in the room. Emily's heart raced as the figure in the mirror reached for her brother, its long, bony fingers closing in on him. And then the mirror shattered. Emily stumbled backward as the mirror shattered before her eyes, the sound of breaking glass ringing in her ears. She felt as though the world was spinning around her, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the dark remnants of the mirror that now lay scattered across the floor, like broken pieces of her own shattered reality. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that made her feel as though she was the last person on Earth. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, and her hands were shaking uncontrollably. The reflection had been so real. Jason's face, trapped in that twisted, horrifying version of the forest, staring back at her with wide, pleading eyes. What had just happened? What was that thing? And more importantly, where was Jason now? Jason! Emily called out into the dark cabin, her voice trembling. She didn't know if she was calling to him or to herself, as though hoping that somehow she could wake up from this nightmare. But there was no answer. The only sound was the faint crackling of the candle, its weak flame flickering against the oppressive darkness that seemed to grow thicker with every passing moment. Emily turned in a circle, her mind racing. What now? What was she supposed to do? She couldn't stay here. The cabin felt wrong, its walls closing in on her, suffocating her with its darkness. The door, which had creaked open on its own just moments ago, now looked as though it had become part of the shadowy walls. The way out seemed farther and farther away, and yet she felt as though something was drawing her back toward the broken mirror. She hesitated, her eyes flickering to the shards of glass scattered across the floor. They glittered, sharp and dangerous, reflecting the dim candlelight in strange, distorted ways. A sudden, inexplicable urge to pick them up overtook her, and before she could stop herself, she knelt down, her fingers brushing the cold glass. A strange, cold sensation ran through her fingers as she touched the shards, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to tilt, the shadows shifting as though they were alive. The pieces of glass reflected a distorted version of her surroundings, just as they had with Jason in the woods. Only now, the cabin's reflection was twisted and wrong. The walls were bending, the floor was cracking, and in the corner of the reflection, something moved, something watching her. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and she jerked her hand away from the glass. She scrambled backward, her heart pounding as she stood up and backed away from the shards. The reflection in the mirror had been unsettling enough, but now, even the fragments of glass seemed to be alive with malevolent energy. The air in the cabin felt thicker, more oppressive, and the shadows seemed to stretch, warping and twisting into grotesque shapes. Emily's mind raced with terror. She had to get out of here. Whatever this place was, whatever this mirror was, it wasn't natural. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't stay here any longer. The door. She had to reach the door. She hurried toward it, her steps echoing in the silent cabin. But just as her hand reached for the doorknob, a loud crash sounded behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The mirror. It wasn't broken anymore. It was whole again. The reflection in the glass was no longer the distorted, shattered mess of a few moments ago. Instead, it was perfect, too perfect. And in the reflection, Emily could see herself standing there, frozen in fear, her hand still hovering over the doorknob. But there was something else, something that made her stomach churn with dread. Jason's face was in the reflection once more, but this time, it was different. His eyes were wide with terror, and his mouth was open as though he was trying to scream, but no sound came from his lips. His hand pressed against the glass, as though he was trying to reach her, to pull her into the mirror. And behind him, in the darkness of the reflection, something else moved. A figure, a shadow, dark and twisted, its form barely visible, but its presence undeniable. It was huge, towering, its eyes glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she realized that the figure wasn't just in the reflection. It was coming closer. It was coming for her. "Jason!" she screamed, her voice cracking. She reached out for the mirror, but before she could touch it, the image in the glass shifted again. The figure in the background was now standing directly behind Jason, its long, gnarled fingers brushing against his shoulders. Jason's eyes widened even further, his face a mask of pure fear, but he couldn't move, couldn't escape. Emily's mind raced. She had to help him. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand here and watch as he was taken. With trembling hands, she reached for the broken shards of glass at her feet. She didn't know what she planned to do with them, but the mirror had taken her brother once, and she wasn't going to let it happen again. She was done being afraid. As she lifted the shard, the candle flickered out, plunging the cabin into darkness. The cold, suffocating air surrounded her, and she could hear the sound of something moving in the shadows. She could feel it. It was getting closer. Suddenly, a hand, cold, clammy, gripped her wrist, sending a jolt of ice through her veins. Emily gasped, her breath catching in her throat. But before she could react, a voice whispered in her ear. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was low, raspy, as though it came from somewhere deep within the forest itself. Emily spun around, but there was no one there, only the shadows. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she staggered backward, the cold, clammy hand that had gripped her wrist now gone. But the sense of something lurking in the shadows remained, suffocating the air around her. She couldn't breathe. The very walls of the cabin seemed to be closing in on her. The shadows, long and twisted, moved like living things, their shapes shifting in the dark corners of the room. They were watching her. The voice, low and raspy, still echoed in her mind. "You shouldn't have come." The words repeated like a haunting melody, each one laced with malice. Emily spun around, her eyes frantically scanning the empty room. But there was no one there, just the dark corners and the broken mirror, its reflection once again clear, showing an image of her standing frozen in terror. She didn't know what to do. The forest outside the cabin seemed so far away, and the door felt as though it were miles from her now. The broken shards of the mirror on the floor gleamed in the low light, as if mocking her. And then, there was the figure in the reflection, its eyes glowing brighter than before. It was still there, standing behind her in the glass, its monstrous presence radiating from the very surface. Emily took a step back. The mirror had shown her Jason, trapped in some kind of nightmare, but now it was showing her something else, a reflection of her own fear. The shadow in the glass was moving, getting closer, its dark form creeping toward her. And suddenly, Emily realized something even more terrifying. The figure wasn't just in the reflection. It was in the room with her. A cold breeze swept through the cabin, stirring the dust on the floor and making the shadows dance. Emily turned quickly, her breath catching in her throat as she looked around. The room seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though it had expanded since she had last seen it. The walls felt like they were breathing, the floor creaking beneath her feet, and the darkness, thick and oppressive, pressed in from every direction. She wasn't alone anymore. The figure was closer now, and this time Emily could feel it. The air had turned ice cold, and her breath came out in quick, visible puffs. It was standing just behind her, its presence a heavy weight on her chest, suffocating her. She could hear its breathing, slow, deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. "Who? What are you?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Her fingers clenched around the shard of mirror in her hand, the only weapon she could think of in this nightmare. The shadow didn't answer. It didn't need to. Emily could feel its dark energy, its hatred, pulsing around her, growing stronger with each passing second. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. It was as though her body had become frozen in place, trapped in the dark, twisted reality the mirror had created. But then, she heard something else. Faint at first, like a whisper in the distance, but growing louder, closer. A voice familiar, desperate. "Jason." "Emily." The voice was hoarse, strained, as if it had traveled from a place far away. It seemed to come from the direction of the mirror, but when Emily turned to look, all she could see was the reflection of her own fear staring back at her. The figure in the glass had grown larger, now standing directly behind her. She could feel its cold breath on the back of her neck, and she couldn't stop herself from shuddering in terror. "Jason." Emily's voice broke through the tension, barely a whisper. She wasn't sure if the voice had really come from her brother, or if it was just another trick of the mirror. But she had to know. She had to try. She turned to face the mirror, her heart racing, and for a moment, everything seemed still. The reflection of the room was the same, only now Jason was there again, his face twisted in agony. He was standing on the other side of the glass, his hand pressed against it, trying to reach her. But he couldn't. The figure behind him was closer now, its grotesque shape blotting out the light, swallowing him whole. "No!" Emily cried, rushing toward the mirror, her hand outstretched. "Jason!" But as her fingers brushed the glass, everything changed. The reflection of Jason seemed to fade, swallowed by the shadows, and in his place, something far worse appeared. The figure from the shadows, the thing that had been standing behind her, was now fully visible in the glass. It was towering, its shape hard to define, like a mass of shifting darkness, but its eyes, glowing with a sickly yellow light, stared directly at Emily. It was watching her. Without thinking, Emily swung the shard of glass at the mirror, but as soon as it touched the surface, the glass shuddered, and a burst of light blinded her. She stumbled back, her eyes squeezed shut against the brightness. When she opened them again, the mirror was gone. The wall was empty. For a moment, Emily stood frozen in disbelief, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The mirror was gone. Had it shattered? Had it disappeared entirely? The air in the cabin was thick with an unsettling silence. She strained her ears, hoping to hear something, anything, but all she could hear was her own breathing, ragged and uneven. The room around her felt colder now, darker, as though the very essence of the cabin had shifted into something darker, more sinister. She looked around, her eyes darting from corner to corner, her breath coming faster with each passing second. The door, her only way out, was still there, but it felt like it was miles away. The walls seemed to pulse, like the cabin was alive, its very structure breathing with the darkness. And then, just as she thought she might lose her grip on reality, she heard something else. A creak. Soft, almost inaudible at first, but growing louder. Something was moving in the shadows. Emily's blood ran cold. She wasn't alone anymore. Slowly, cautiously, she turned toward the sound, her body trembling as the darkness around her seemed to shift and move. She could feel it now. A presence, lurking just beyond the edge of her vision, waiting for her to make a move. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure, a shadow, and it was moving closer. Emily froze. She wanted to scream, but the air had thickened around her, choking her voice. The thing was almost upon her now, its shape barely visible in the dim light. But she could feel it, its cold, malevolent presence crawling under her skin. It was too late to run. Emily's heart raced as she stood frozen in the middle of the cabin. The figure in the corner was no longer just a shadow. It was something solid, something tangible. Its shape was unclear, shifting with the movement of the darkness itself. Every time she blinked, it seemed to grow, taking on more form, more substance. A feeling of dread washed over her, like an ice-cold wave crashing over her body. The air was thick, heavy, as if the room was suffocating her. She could barely breathe. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor, her body paralyzed with fear. The thing in the corner was getting closer, and there was nowhere to hide. Emily's mind raced. Her hand still clutched the shard of mirror, the only weapon she had left. But as she stared at the figure, she couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror, whatever power it had, was losing its hold on her. It had started with curiosity. The mirror, found deep in the woods, had lured her in with promises of answers. answers she had no right to seek. And now it had shown her things she could never unsee. The reflection had twisted reality, pulling her into a world where fear was the only truth. She wanted to scream, to call for Jason, but the words wouldn't come. The silence in the room was deafening. The figure was almost upon her now. It was no longer a shadow, but a dark, looming presence that seemed to swallow the very light in the cabin. Emily's hands shook as she raised the shard in front of her, as though it could protect her from the dark force closing in. Her fingers trembled, her mind racing. What was this thing? Where had it come from? And why was it following her? Emily. The voice came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the voice of her brother, Jason, anymore. It was the voice from the mirror, low, cold, and filled with malice. Emily's eyes darted around the room, desperate for an escape, but the walls seemed to close in tighter with each passing second. The door was still there, but it felt so far away, like it had been placed in another world altogether. The windows were covered with thick layers of dust, blocking out any hope of seeing the outside world. The only thing left was the thing in the corner, growing closer by the second. And then it spoke again. "You shouldn't have come." The words were whispered, like a breath against her ear, sending a chill down her spine. Emily stumbled backward, her pulse pounding in her ears. She couldn't think. She couldn't move. All she could do was watch as the figure took a step closer. And then another. The space between them was closing. There was no escape. Suddenly, the thing lunged forward, its form expanding like a wave crashing onto the shore. But just as it reached out for her, Emily slammed her eyes shut, praying for the nightmare to end. But it didn't. She felt a cold hand wrap around her wrist, pulling her toward the dark presence. A voice, clearer this time, whispered in her ear, "You've seen too much. Now you belong to it." Her stomach twisted in terror. No, she couldn't be its prisoner. She had to get away. She had to find a way out. Her grip on the mirror shard tightened as she tried to pull herself free from the cold hand that had seized her. But it wouldn't let go. The darkness surrounding her seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat, slow and steady, as if the room itself was alive. Her thoughts blurred, her mind spinning. She had to think. What had happened to Jason? Was he still trapped in the reflection? What was this thing that was holding her now? Was it connected to the mirror? To the forest? But before she could gather her thoughts, a sudden flash of light erupted from the mirror on the floor. Emily gasped, blinking against the brightness. The figure that had been holding her released its grip, its form vanishing into the light. She stumbled back, clutching the shard to her chest, her heart hammering in her throat. For a moment, everything was silent. The light from the mirror slowly faded, leaving only the darkness and the feeling of the room closing in around her. Emily's eyes darted to the floor, to the shard of glass that had fallen from her hand. The mirror, whatever it was gone. But it didn't feel like the danger was over. If anything, it felt like the darkness had become stronger, more persistent, now that the mirror had vanished. And then, Emily heard something she hadn't expected. A voice, a whisper. "Help me." It was Jason's voice. She turned toward the sound, her breath caught in her throat. The voice had come from the direction of the mirror, but there was no reflection. There was nothing but the wall, dark and empty. She stepped forward, hesitant, her heart in her throat. The voice came again, this time louder, more desperate. "Please, Emily, help me, Jason." It was definitely his voice. "Jason," she called, her voice trembling as she took another step toward the wall. "Where are you?" But there was no answer. The room was silent again, save for the sound of her own ragged breathing. Emily's hands trembled as she reached out to touch the wall, feeling for something, anything, that could explain the voice. But the wall was solid, cold beneath her fingers. She closed her eyes, willing herself to stay calm. She couldn't let fear take over. Jason needed her. She had to find him. She had to end this nightmare. She had to get out of this cabin. "Please, Emily." The voice was coming from inside her mind now, not from the wall. She could feel it, deep inside her skull, echoing through her thoughts. Jason's voice. It was like the mirror had become a gateway into his very soul. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to concentrate. The mirror had shown her things, strange, terrifying things. Was it still working? Was it somehow still connected to Jason? Or had it disappeared, taking him with it? She could feel something shifting in the room. A change, something almost imperceptible at first, but growing stronger by the second. The air was thick again, too thick to breathe, and the shadows seemed to pulse with a rhythm of their own. Emily turned toward the door, her mind racing. The darkness was closing in. "Jason," she whispered again, feeling her way toward the door, her hands trembling. The voice inside her mind was growing louder now, almost unbearable. Then, just as she reached the door, the room went completely dark. Emily's breath quickened as she stood motionless in the cabin. Her fingers pressed against the cold wood of the door. It was as if the room had become a living entity, pulsating with a malevolent energy that seemed to breathe alongside her. Every corner of the cabin felt oppressive, the walls closing in around her, and she was acutely aware of every sound. The rhythmic thumping of her heart, the shallow, rapid intake of air, the low, distant hum that seemed to echo from the very floorboards beneath her feet. For a long moment, she stood there, paralyzed, her senses overwhelmed by the overwhelming sense of dread. Her body trembled uncontrollably, her mind clouded with confusion. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was something much more sinister. It was a presence, something ancient, something that had lived in the woods for centuries. And it was here with her now. A shiver ran down her spine as she instinctively reached for the shard of mirror she had discarded earlier. The piece of glass, which had once felt like a lifeline, was now just another piece of the puzzle that didn't seem to fit. What was happening? Was Jason still alive? Was he somewhere in this cabin? Or had he been lost to the mirror forever? And if he was still out there, somewhere, how could she possibly save him? The voice, Jason's voice, it had been in her head, inside her mind, begging for help. Emily had heard it so clearly, so desperately, but now there was nothing. Only the oppressive silence and the dark force that seemed to grow stronger by the second. Was the mirror connected to the voice? Was Jason trapped inside it, lost between worlds? As if in answer to her unspoken thoughts, a cold gust of wind swept through the cabin, making the door rattle in its frame. The temperature dropped sharply, and Emily's breath fogged in front of her face. She could hear the sound of something dragging across the floor, a low scraping noise that seemed to come from the shadows. Slowly, her eyes adjusted to the dark, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The shadows in the room were no longer just shapes. They were moving, swirling, as if something was shifting within them. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Someone was in the room with her, and it was moving toward her. The scraping sound grew louder, accompanied by the faint sound of breathing. It wasn't Jason's breath. No, this was something darker, something ancient, filled with malice. The air grew heavier, pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. She felt her legs wobble beneath her, threatening to give way, but she couldn't move. Fear had a firm grip on her, freezing her in place. And then she saw it. A shape emerged from the shadows in front of her, slowly becoming clearer, taking form. At first, it was nothing but a shifting mass of darkness, a blur of movement. But as it drew closer, Emily's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive in the way she understood life. It was something else entirely. A figure, tall, thin, and grotesque, loomed before her, its body twisted and bent in unnatural ways. The creature's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were hollow black pits, devoid of any light or humanity. Its face was a mask of sheer terror, an expression of anguish frozen in time. The figure was covered in dark, oily tendrils that seemed to writhe and reach out, as though they were alive, as though they were extensions of its will. Emily's breath hitched as it took a step forward, the floor creaking beneath its weight. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the thing before her. It was coming closer, and with every step, the air seemed to grow colder, thicker, more oppressive. The thing stopped just a few feet away from her, its face inches from hers. It didn't speak, didn't need to. Its presence was enough to paralyze her, to leave her shaking in fear. It was as though it was feeding on her terror, drawing strength from her fear. And in that moment, Emily realized that it wasn't just the room that was closing in around her. It was the creature itself, pressing in from all sides, suffocating her mind and soul. And then, in a voice that was nothing more than a whisper, barely audible but clear as day, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The words were chilling, like ice-cold water poured over her skin. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she tried to move, to break free from its grip, but she couldn't. It was as if the room itself was holding her captive, trapping her in place. Why are you doing this?" Emily whispered, her voice barely a breath. The figure's hollow eyes seemed to narrow, the dark tendrils reaching out, wrapping around her arms, her legs, pulling her closer. The darkness swirled around her, and the creature's face twisted in a sickening smile. "Because you looked," it rasped, its voice like the scratching of nails on a chalkboard. "You looked, and now you are part of it." The words sent a shock through Emily, as if they were a physical blow. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she thought she might faint. "Part of it? What do you mean?" The creature's smile widened, showing rows of jagged, impossibly sharp teeth. "The mirror. It shows you what you're not supposed to see. It opens doors, and once they're open, they can't be closed. You'll never leave. You'll never escape." Emily's mind raced. The mirror. It had been calling to her, showing her visions, terrifying visions. But she had never imagined it could hold such power. She had never understood what it really was. Now it was too late. She had crossed a line she could never come back from. "No," Emily whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But the figure only laughed, a sound that made her blood run cold. "It's all too real now." Suddenly, the tendrils around her body tightened, constricting like chains, and Emily gasped in pain. The creature loomed closer, its foul breath hitting her face. She felt the darkness closing in around her, choking her. But then, through the suffocating fog, she heard something. A sound, a voice clear and strong. "Jason." "Emily." Jason's voice rang out from the depths of the darkness. "Get out of here. Don't listen to it." Emily's heart skipped a beat, hope sparking in her chest. She twisted her head, her eyes searching frantically in the dark. "Jason," she called out. The voice came again, louder this time, full of urgency. "Run. Get out." And in that instant, something shifted. The figure in front of her seemed to hesitate, its hold loosening for just a fraction of a second. Emily seized the moment, breaking free from its grip. With a burst of adrenaline, She ran toward the door, her legs finally obeying, her feet slamming against the floor. But as she reached the door, she felt a hand, cold and unyielding, grab her wrist, pulling her back. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the cold hand tightened around her wrist, pulling her back toward the shadows. The voice that had called her name, Jason's voice, still echoed in her ears, but it was fading, becoming distant, as if it had been swallowed by the very darkness that surrounded her. Panic surged through her body, and she fought against the grip that held her fast. She twisted and yanked, her mind scrambling for a way out, but the hand, ice cold and unyielding, held her in place, dragging her back toward the creature. The tendrils of darkness coiled around her legs, pulling her deeper into the abyss. She could feel the oppressive weight of the room pressing down on her, and she knew that if she didn't escape now, she might never leave this place. With a surge of adrenaline, Emily grabbed the shard of mirror she had dropped earlier. She had no idea how it would help, but it was her only chance. She swung it at the tendrils, hoping the sharp edges would cut through the darkness. The mirror shard connected with the black tendrils, sending a sharp jolt through her body, but instead of cutting through, it seemed to absorb the strike, almost as if the darkness had swallowed it whole. The figure before her grinned, its jagged teeth gleaming in the dim light. "You can't escape," it hissed, its voice like the rasping of dry leaves. "This place is your prison now. You looked, and now you belong here." "No!" Emily cried out, her pulse racing. "I won't stay here." With all her strength, she wrenched her wrist free from the creature's grasp, the cold touch sending a shock-wave of fear through her body. She took a step backward, stumbling, her legs weak from the terror that had gripped her. The darkness seemed to thicken, swirling around her like a living entity, and the air felt thick with malevolent energy. She didn't know where to go, but she knew she had to move. The door. She had to reach the door. Emily's feet carried her forward, her body moving almost on instinct, the only thought in her mind to get out. The darkness pressed in around her, but she refused to let it consume her. She could hear the creature's laughter in her ears, mocking her, but she kept moving, the light of the cabin door in the distance beckoning her. But just as she reached the threshold, something cold and sharp slammed into her side. She gasped, her body jerked back, and she found herself falling into the darkness once more. A sharp pain shot through her chest, and she cried out in agony. The tendrils of darkness wrapped around her, pulling her back into the suffocating blackness. She struggled, but the grip was too strong. She tried to scream, but her voice was lost in the thick air, swallowed by the overwhelming darkness that was now all around her. "Emily!" Jason's voice called again, this time much closer. It was faint, distorted, as though coming from a great distance. But it was there, and it gave her hope. "Emily, get out. You have to fight." The words, though distorted, were enough to spark something inside her. She couldn't give up now. She couldn't let this place take her like it had taken Jason. She couldn't let herself be consumed by this nightmare. With every ounce of strength she had left, Emily wrenched herself free from the tendrils. She felt a surge of power, pure, raw will, suddenly flood through her. The creature's laughter faded, replaced by a low growl of frustration. Emily didn't hesitate. She turned and bolted toward the door, her chest heaving as she ran faster than she ever had before. The door was within reach, just a few more steps, but as she reached the door, she felt something grab her from behind again, stronger this time. A piercing scream tore from her throat as the darkness tried to pull her back into its clutches. The air around her grew thick and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. "Jason!" she screamed, but her voice cracked, and no answer came. It was as if the cabin had become a living nightmare, a place where every step forward only pulled her deeper into its trap. The door seemed to shrink before her eyes, growing smaller and smaller, until it was nothing more than a distant memory. Suddenly, a new sound emerged, a low, guttural growl, far worse than the creature's laughter. It was as if something far older, far more terrifying, had woken up. Emily's eyes went wide as she turned toward the source of the noise, her body trembling in fear. What was it? What had she unleashed? The walls of the cabin seemed to shift, the air vibrating with an unearthly energy. Her mirror, was glowing now, casting a faint, eerie light that spread across the room, illuminating the horrors that had once been hidden in the shadows. Emily's stomach churned as she looked toward it, and she realized this was no ordinary mirror. It was a portal, a doorway to another world, a world where fear and darkness ruled. The mirror's surface rippled like water, distorting the image of the cabin beyond. The reflection was different, twisted. The room was no longer the cabin she had known. It was a place of darkness, a place where the laws of nature no longer applied. The walls seemed to melt, the floor warped, and the ceiling stretched far beyond what was possible. And standing in the middle of the twisted room was Jason, or what was left of him. He was no longer the man she had known. His eyes were wide, hollow, filled with an unfathomable terror. His face was contorted in agony, his body distorted, as if the darkness had taken hold of him, transformed him into something else, something monstrous. And yet, despite the horror that surrounded him, his mouth opened in a silent scream, his eyes pleading for help. Emily's heart lurched in her chest. She had to save him. She couldn't let him become one with this nightmare. But as she took a step forward, a loud, deafening crack echoed through the room. The floor beneath her feet splintered, and she fell, tumbling into the darkness below. She tried to scream, but the air was stolen from her lungs, and her body was pulled deeper into the abyss. Emily's fall seemed endless. The darkness around her was thick, swallowing her whole. She couldn't see anything, just felt the weight of the air pressing down on her, dragging her deeper into the void. Her heart raced as panic flooded her senses. Every part of her screamed for release, for escape, but there was nothing, only the crushing blackness. Then, with a sudden jolt, she hit something solid. The ground. She gasped for breath, but the air was still suffocating, heavy. She rolled over, her limbs aching from the fall, but there was no time to dwell on the pain. She had to move. She had to escape. She pushed herself to her feet, her eyes straining against the darkness. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She was disoriented, confused. Everything around her felt wrong, like a twisted version of reality. She turned, scanning the darkness, trying to find a way out. But there was no way out, no escape, only the infinite shadows closing in on her. Suddenly, a soft glow appeared in the distance, faint at first, but growing brighter as she approached. Emily's breath hitched in her chest. She didn't know if it was hope or desperation that drove her forward, but she moved toward the light. As she drew closer, the air around her shifted, thickened, almost like it was alive. The light grew clearer, and she realized with a shock that it was coming from the mirror. The same mirror that had led her here. The same mirror that had trapped Jason. Her heart skipped a beat. She had to reach the mirror. She had to break the curse. But as she moved closer, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Jason. His image was distorted in the reflection, his face twisted in torment. His eyes were wide, glowing with a hollow, unearthly light, and his mouth moved as though trying to scream, but no sound came out. The world behind him was fractured. like pieces of a shattered glass. "No," Emily whispered, stepping closer, her hand trembling. "Jason." But it wasn't Jason anymore. The creature that had once been him now stood in the mirror, its form a grotesque version of her friend. Its eyes gleamed with hunger, and its smile was too wide, too unnatural. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. This thing wasn't Jason. This was the darkness that had consumed him. "Help me," the thing whispered, its voice distorted, a mocking parody of the man she had known. "No," Emily shouted, her voice trembling with fear and anger. "I won't help you. You're not Jason." The creature in the mirror grinned wider, its teeth sharp and yellow. It stepped forward, its image moving with an eerie fluidity, as if it were more than a reflection. It stretched out a long, gnarled hand toward Emily, the claws at the end of its fingers gleaming in the pale light. "You're too late," it hissed. "The mirror has claimed us both. You belong to it now." "No," Emily cried again, taking a step back. "I won't become like you." The mirror trembled, the surface rippling like water. She could feel the pull, an invisible force trying to drag her in. It was as if the mirror was alive, breathing, reaching for her. The darkness around her seemed to warp, twisting and writhing as though it, too, was a part of the mirror's power. She could feel it, the cold fingers of the void closing in on her, threatening to swallow her whole. But Emily wasn't going down without a fight. She grabbed the shard of the mirror she had carried with her, the sharp edges digging into her palm. She didn't know if it would work, but she had no choice. She swung the shard at the mirror, hoping to break it, to shatter the curse that had held them both captive. The mirror cracked. A loud, violent crack echoed through the space, and the light around her flickered. The creature in the reflection screamed in agony as the mirror split, its form warping and distorting. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the crack spread across the surface, splintering the image of Jason, and the thing that had replaced him, into jagged shards. The force of the shattering mirror sent a shockwave through the air, and the darkness around her seemed to recoil, as if the mirror's power had been severed. Emily stumbled back, her heart pounding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The room, the endless void, seemed to shift, to breathe, to change. She could feel the weight of the darkness lightening, but she didn't dare stop. She ran, her legs pumping beneath her, her body moving on instinct. The air was still thick with the remnants of the mirror's power, but she could feel it. Its grip was weakening. She had to find Jason. She had to get him out of the mirror before it was too late. But as she turned, she heard a sound. A low, menacing growl, deep and guttural. She froze. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the shadows around her thickened once more. This time not with the same eerie calm, but with a palpable sense of rage. Emily's heart raced as she slowly turned, her eyes widening in horror. From the shadows emerged something far worse than the creature in the mirror. It was a figure, tall and dark, draped in shadows that seemed to pulse with an unnatural life. Its eyes glowed with the same hollow, spectral light that had consumed Jason. Its mouth stretched open, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It was no longer a reflection. It was real. The creature took a step forward, its long limbs moving with unnatural grace. Emily took a step back, her body stiff with fear. She could feel it. This wasn't just the curse of the mirror anymore. This was something far older, far more ancient. The creature's voice was a whisper, but it echoed in her mind like a storm. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have looked." Emily's stomach churned, her body frozen in place. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to fight it, but there was no running. Not anymore. She knew then. There was only one way to end it. One way to break the curse once and for all. The mirror. Emily turned and ran toward the shattered mirror. She grabbed the jagged edges of the broken glass, the shards biting into her hands as she pulled them free. She turned to face the creature, her enemy, the thing that had taken Jason, that had tried to take her. It was coming toward her, its eyes filled with fury, its mouth opening to unleash another scream. But Emily was ready. She held the shards up, her arms trembling but her resolve unshakable. She had to break the mirror, and she had to do it now.